The people laughing that morning thought they were watching a joke. What they were really watching was the first step in building an empire. Nobody in Millfield expected trouble before sunrise. The neighborhood was usually quiet. A few porch lights glowed, a few early workers prepared for long shifts. Most people were still asleep when the first flatbed truck rolled onto Cartmill Road. Then came a second truck. Then a third. By 6 o'clock, 12 broken vehicles sat in 2 crooked rows across the front of Owen Calloway's property. Rusted pickups. Damaged sedans. Engine-less shells, cars that had already been abandoned by owners, repair shops, and salvage yards. Handwritten signs hung from several mirrors. For scrap. Across town, Diana Voss watched photographs arrive on her phone. Owner of 3 successful dealerships, Diana had spent years building a reputation for getting exactly what she wanted. Most property owners eventually accepted her offers, most competitors eventually moved aside. Owen Calloway had done neither. Months earlier, he had quietly refused to sell the small piece of land she wanted near the highway expansion project. He had not argued, he had not negotiated. He had simply said, no. Diana never liked unanswered resistance. So she created a spectacle. By 7 o'clock, neighbors gathered along the street, phones appeared, photos spread through social media. Laughter followed. The story moved quickly. Someone had dumped 12 junk cars on the single dad's property. Some called it harmless fun. Others called it humiliation. Most simply enjoyed watching. Inside the house, Owen stood at the kitchen window holding a coffee mug. His 7-year-old daughter Bonnie stood beside him. She stared at the collection of wrecked vehicles covering their front yard. For several seconds neither spoke. Finally, Bonnie looked up. Dad. Owen kept his eyes on the driveway. Yeah, Bonnie hesitated. Did we do something wrong? The question hung in the quiet kitchen. Owen looked down at her. She held a spoon in one hand, and wore the serious expression she always had when something truly mattered. Outside, another neighbor stopped to take pictures. More laughter drifted across the yard. Owen set down his coffee. No, sweetheart. Bonnie looked back through the window. Then why would somebody do this? Owen opened the front door and stepped outside. Cool morning air moved across the property. He walked past the first vehicle, then the second, then the third. He never looked toward the neighbors, never reacted to the crowd, never acknowledged the jokes. He simply studied the cars, one by one, quietly, carefully. By the time he reached the 12th vehicle, something had changed in his expression. Not anger, not embarrassment, something else. Something thoughtful. Bonnie watched from the porch as her father rested a hand on the fender of the nearest wreck and smiled very slightly. And for the first time that morning, Owen Calloway looked less like a man being punished and more like a man who had just been handed an opportunity nobody else could see. Most people expected Owen to call a towing company before noon. By sunset, the entire town expected the wrecks to be gone. Instead, the 12 vehicles remained exactly where they were. The only difference was that Owen had begun moving between them with a notebook in one hand and a flashlight in the other. He worked slowly. Deliberately. As if every dent, every missing panel, and every rusted bolt deserved attention. The neighbors noticed. They did not understand it, but they noticed. By mid-afternoon, several people had parked across the street just to watch. Some laughed, some shook their heads. One man joked that Owen was calculating how much the scrap yard would charge him to haul everything away. Owen never responded. Bonnie followed him from car to car carrying a small folding chair. She sat nearby while he inspected engines, checked identification numbers, and opened compartments nobody else would have bothered looking at. Around 4 o'clock, he stopped beside an old pickup near the back of the row. The truck looked worse than the others, the paint had disappeared decades earlier. One door barely hung on its hinges. Most people would have walked past it without a second glance. Owen climbed inside. Bonnie watched from her chair. Several minutes passed, then another. Finally, Owen emerged holding a small metal box covered in dust. Bonnie immediately stood. "What is it?" Owen brushed dirt from the lid. Not sure yet. He opened it carefully. Inside sat several documents protected by old plastic sleeves. Most were faded beyond recognition. One was not. Owen studied the paper for several seconds, then he folded it and slipped it into his pocket. Across the street, two neighbors exchanged curious looks. Bonnie noticed the change in her father's expression. "Did you find something important?" she asked. Owen looked back at the truck. "Maybe." That evening, after dinner, Bonnie sat at the kitchen table drawing pictures while Owen spread the documents across the counter. The paper he had removed from the box turned out to be an ownership record connected to a specialty parts supplier that had closed nearly 20 years earlier. Most people would not have recognized the name. Owen did. He remembered it from his early years working on restoration projects. The company had produced a limited number of components highly sought after by collectors. His eyes moved from the paperwork back to the truck sitting outside. Suddenly, the vehicle looked very different. At the same moment, several miles away, Diana Voss enjoyed dinner with investors, while stories about the junk car prank continued spreading through town. She smiled when someone mentioned Owen. The room laughed. Diana laughed too. None of them knew that the first of the 12 vehicles had already begun paying for itself. And Owen had only examined one. The next morning, Owen started with the second vehicle. Unlike the pickup truck, this one was an aging sedan covered in rust and years of neglect. Most of the windows were broken. The interior smelled like damp fabric and old paper. To everyone watching from across the street, it looked worthless. That alone made Owen curious. Over the years, he had learned that people often overlook things simply because they appeared unattractive. Bonnie followed him outside carrying a small notebook of her own. She sat on the porch steps while he worked. The crowd had grown again. More neighbors stopped by on their way to work. A local blogger even parked nearby and began recording videos. The story of the 12 abandoned vehicles had become the town's favorite source of entertainment. Owen ignored all of them. He opened the trunk and began sorting through decades of forgotten items. Boxes. Tools. Old registration papers. Receipts. Nothing unusual at first. Then he discovered a locked metal case hidden beneath a loose panel. He studied it for a moment before carrying it into the garage. Bonnie immediately noticed. "Another maybe?" she asked. Owen smiled slightly. "Maybe." Several hours later, after carefully opening the case, he found what looked like inventory records from a specialty restoration company that had disappeared years ago. The documents listed rare components purchased and stored by collectors throughout the region. Most names meant nothing to Bonnie. They meant something to Owen. One particular entry caused him to stop reading. He looked at it twice. Then a third time. The item described in the record was worth far more than the entire sedan. More importantly, the paperwork revealed where several forgotten parts might still exist. Across town, Diana Voss arrived at one of her dealerships for a meeting with regional managers. Business remained strong. Sales numbers looked healthy. Expansion plans continued moving forward. During a break, one manager mentioned the growing attention surrounding Owen's property. Diana dismissed it immediately. "People are fascinated by nonsense," she said. The room laughed. The conversation moved on. Meanwhile, Owen walked toward the third vehicle. This one had no engine and no wheels. The body rested directly on wooden blocks. Most people considered it scrap. Owen considered it information. By late afternoon, he had already uncovered additional clues connecting the third vehicle to the same network mentioned in the newly discovered records. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. These vehicles had not arrived randomly. Hidden among the wrecks were pieces of forgotten value that only someone with patience and knowledge could recognize. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, Bonnie sat beside her father on the garage floor. "Do you think she knew?" she asked quietly. Owen looked toward the line of damaged vehicles outside, then he looked back at the papers spread across the workbench. "No," he said. "I think she only saw junk." Bonnie nodded thoughtfully. Owen returned to the documents. For the second day in a row, one discarded vehicle had revealed something unexpected. And there were still 9 more waiting. By the end of the first week, the atmosphere around Owen's property had changed completely. The laughter had not disappeared, but curiosity was beginning to replace it. Every day someone new stopped by the driveway, some came to take photographs, others came to ask questions. Most left confused. They expected to find a frustrated single father surrounded by junk. Instead, they found a calm man working methodically through 12 vehicles that seemed to grow more interesting with each passing day. The 4th vehicle turned out to be an old delivery van with faded company markings barely visible beneath years of dirt. Owen spent most of Saturday examining it. Bonnie sat nearby with a sandwich and a notebook, occasionally recording things she considered important. Around noon, Owen discovered a hidden storage compartment built into the rear wall. The compartment contained dozens of original catalogs, supplier contacts, and handwritten notes dating back nearly 20 years. To most people, it looked like a box of old paperwork. To Owen, it looked like a map. Several names appeared repeatedly throughout the documents. They belonged to collectors, restoration experts, and specialty buyers scattered across multiple states. By Sunday evening, Owen had already contacted 3 of them. The first conversation lasted 15 minutes. The second lasted nearly an hour. The third ended with someone offering to drive 600 miles just to inspect a collection of parts connected to the records. Bonnie noticed the change immediately. "They sound excited," she said. Owen nodded. "They are." "Why?" she asked. Owen looked down at the paperwork. "Because some things become valuable when everyone else forgets about them." Across town, Diana Voss continued focusing on her business expansion plans. She had meetings with investors, contractors, and city officials. The highway development project remained one of her highest priorities. During one meeting, an assistant mentioned that local automotive groups had started discussing Owen online. Diana barely looked up from her reports. "People get bored," she said. "They will find something else to talk about next week." Unfortunately for her, the opposite happened. The following Tuesday, a collector from Kansas arrived at Owen's garage. The man spent nearly 3 hours reviewing documents from the van and examining several parts recovered from the first 3 vehicles. When he finally left, he purchased a small collection of components for more money than most people in town expected Owen to earn in months. News traveled fast. By evening, everyone knew somebody had paid serious money for items discovered inside what they still called junk cars. The story became harder to laugh at. As the sun set, Owen stood in the garage, reviewing fresh notes, while Bonnie organized receipts into neat stacks. Outside, 8 vehicles still remained untouched. Inside, the first 4 had already begun creating opportunities nobody had expected, and for the first time, a few people in town started wondering whether Diana Voss had made a very expensive mistake. The 5th vehicle sat at the far end of the property, partially hidden behind the others. It was the one Owen had ignored until now, not because it looked unimportant, but because it looked too ordinary. A faded utility truck with missing mirrors and a damaged hood rarely attracted attention. By this point, however, Owen had learned something valuable. The more forgettable a vehicle appeared, the more carefully he examined it. Early Saturday morning, while Bonnie ate breakfast on the porch, Owen began working through the truck. The crowd had returned again. Some people arrived with folding chairs, others brought coffee and watched from across the street. What started as a joke had quietly become the most interesting thing happening in Millfield. Owen paid no attention. He opened compartments, removed panels, checked serial numbers. Hours passed. Then he discovered something unusual hidden beneath a false floor inside a storage compartment behind the cab. At first glance it looked like an ordinary binder. The cover was stained and worn. The pages inside were not. Owen carried it into the garage and began reading. Bonnie followed. The binder contained purchase records, auction documents, restoration notes, and photographs connected to dozens of rare vehicles that had changed hands over nearly 20 years. Several names appeared repeatedly, some belonged to collectors Owen already recognized. One name stood out above all the others, a nationally known auction broker who specialized in locating extremely difficult automotive parts. Owen stared at the entry for several moments. Then, he picked up the phone. 3 hours later, the broker called back personally. The conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. Bonnie watched from the workbench while her father listened more than he spoke. When the call ended, he remained silent for a long time. "Good news?" Bonnie finally asked. Owen looked at the binder. "Very good news." The documents connected several of the recovered parts from the first vehicles to collectors who had been searching for them for years. More importantly, the broker wanted to visit in person. Across town, Diana Voss received less encouraging news. Construction costs connected to her expansion project had increased again. Several financing discussions had stalled. Nothing serious yet, but enough to create pressure. During a meeting, someone casually mentioned that collectors were now visiting Owen's property. Diana dismissed it with a wave of her hand. Yet later that evening she searched for the story herself. What she found surprised her. Hundreds of comments, thousands of views. People discussing Owen's discoveries as if they mattered. For the first time, she stopped laughing. Back at the garage, Owen reviewed the binder one final time before placing it beside the growing stack of documents recovered from the vehicles. 5 cars examined, 5 unexpected discoveries. Bonnie looked toward the 7 remaining wrecks outside. "Do you think there are more surprises?" she asked. Owen followed her gaze. A faint smile appeared. "I would be disappointed if there were not." The 6th vehicle changed everything. Until then, Owen had been uncovering opportunities. Valuable parts. Forgotten records, useful connections. The 6th vehicle offered something different. It offered scale. The vehicle itself was an aging commercial transport truck with severe rust damage and a missing transmission. Nobody gave it a second glance. Even the people who had stopped laughing weeks earlier barely noticed when Owen began working on it. Bonnie sat nearby reading a library book while he inspected the cargo area. The morning passed quietly. Then, shortly after noon, Owen discovered a sealed compartment hidden behind a damaged interior panel. Inside sat several weatherproof storage cases. He opened them one at a time. The first contained technical manuals, the second contained inventory records. The third contained contact information linked to dozens of restoration businesses across the country. Owen spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents. The deeper he looked, the more valuable they became. What he had found was not a collection of parts. It was a network. Years earlier, a small group of specialty suppliers, restorers, collectors, and brokers had quietly worked together to locate rare automotive components. The organization eventually disappeared, but the relationships remained. Most people never knew it existed. Owen now possessed the records connecting all of them. Bonnie noticed the growing stack of papers on the workbench. "Is it another surprise?" she asked. Owen nodded. "A bigger one." Later that afternoon, he began making phone calls. One conversation led to another. Then, another. By evening, several business owners had expressed interest in working with him. 2 requested partnerships. One offered warehouse space, another offered access to a national collector database. For the first time, Owen realized the opportunity extended far beyond the 12 vehicles sitting in his yard. Across town, Diana's week moved in the opposite direction. Rising costs continued creating pressure. Several expected deals failed to close. Nothing disastrous had happened, but the momentum she once enjoyed was slowing. During a meeting, one executive mentioned hearing Owen's name from a collector in another state. Diana looked up immediately. That had never happened before. She said nothing, but the comment stayed with her. Back at the garage, the changes became visible almost overnight. New visitors arrived carrying business cards instead of cameras. Conversations focused on partnerships instead of jokes. The small workspace behind Owen's house became busier than it had ever been. Bonnie watched everything with quiet fascination. That evening, as they locked the garage, she looked at the remaining 6 vehicles. Do you think all of them are special? Owen studied the line of wrecks beneath the fading sunlight, then he smiled. I think somebody accidentally gave us more than they intended. For the first time since the 12 vehicles arrived, the future no longer looked like a mystery. It looked like the beginning of something much larger. 3 weeks after the 12 vehicles arrived, Owen's garage no longer resembled the quiet workspace it had once been. Delivery trucks came and went throughout the week, collectors scheduled appointments months in advance. Restoration shops from neighboring states called regularly asking for advice, parts, or introductions. The network hidden inside the records from the vehicles had expanded faster than anyone expected. Owen never chased the attention. He simply continued solving problems, connecting people, and honoring agreements. That reputation spread quickly. The 7th vehicle remained untouched until a rainy Tuesday morning. It was an aging utility wagon with severe body damage and missing doors. Most people assumed it contained nothing useful. Owen almost agreed. Even so, he inspected it with the same patience he gave every other vehicle. Bonnie sat inside the garage finishing homework while rain tapped against the roof. Several hours passed before Owen found anything unusual. Hidden beneath a damaged rear panel sat a small metal container secured behind layers of insulation. Inside were property records, business correspondence, and financial statements connected to several automotive facilities that had closed years earlier. One document immediately caught his attention. It described a small warehouse located outside Millfield. The building had been abandoned for nearly a decade. More importantly, ownership complications had left it sitting unused. Owen reviewed the paperwork twice before placing it aside. By evening, he had already arranged a visit. The following day he drove to the property with Bonnie beside him. The warehouse stood near an old industrial district. The exterior looked neglected, but the structure remained solid. Bonnie stared through the truck window. It is bigger than our garage. Owen smiled slightly. A lot bigger. After speaking with local officials and reviewing additional records, he discovered something unexpected. The property could be acquired for far less than its actual value because nobody believed it had any practical use anymore. The situation felt strangely familiar. Across town, Diana faced a series of increasingly difficult decisions. Expansion costs continued rising, 2 major projects were delayed, several investors began asking harder questions during meetings. Diana remained composed, but the certainty that once defined her decisions was beginning to crack. During a lunch meeting, one business owner mentioned hearing that Owen was considering commercial property. Diana looked up immediately. The room fell quiet for a moment. Nobody laughed this time. Back at home, Bonnie walked through the warehouse with her father later that week. Empty floors stretched in every direction, dust covered most surfaces. Yet Owen saw possibility where others saw neglect. Bonnie looked around the enormous building and asked the question that had been forming in her mind all afternoon. What would you do with all this space? Owen studied the empty structure for several seconds, then he looked toward the future he could suddenly see taking shape. Build something that lasts, he said, and for the first time since the 12 vehicles appeared, Owen was no longer thinking about what they contained. He was thinking about what they could become. 6 weeks after the first vehicles appeared, the warehouse was no longer empty. Shelving filled entire sections of the building. Rare parts were organized and catalogued. Restoration projects occupied designated work areas. Collectors traveled from across the country to visit. Small businesses that once struggled to find reliable suppliers now worked directly with Owen's growing operation. None of it happened overnight. Every step came from relationships, records, and opportunities hidden inside the vehicles everyone else had dismissed. The 8th vehicle sat near the back corner of the original row. It was an old station wagon covered by a faded tarp. For weeks, Owen had left it untouched while larger priorities demanded attention. One quiet Friday morning, he finally pulled the tarp away. Bonnie followed him as she always did. The station wagon looked ordinary. The paint was gone. The tires were flat. Several panels showed years of weather damage. Yet by now both of them knew appearances meant very little. Owen spent the morning examining the vehicle. Shortly after lunch, he discovered a compartment hidden beneath the rear cargo floor. Inside sat several folders sealed in protective sleeves. Most contained business correspondence. One folder contained something much more interesting: financial records. Owen carried everything back to the office inside the warehouse and began reviewing the documents. The deeper he looked, the more focused he became. Bonnie noticed immediately. "Another surprise?" she asked. Owen nodded slowly. "A very important one." The records detailed a series of transactions involving multiple automotive businesses throughout the region. Some had succeeded, others had failed. One name appeared repeatedly across dozens of pages: Diana Voss. Owen continued reading. The documents revealed information about several acquisitions made years earlier, including properties, inventory agreements, and dealership obligations. None of it was secret, none of it was illegal. Yet together, the records painted a picture most people could not see. Several of Diana's largest assets depended on conditions that were beginning to change. Later that week, additional news spread through the business community. One of Diana's dealerships was struggling. Rising costs and delayed projects had created pressure. Rumors of a potential sale quietly circulated among investors. Across town, Diana spent longer hours at the office than ever before. Meetings became more frequent. Decisions became more difficult. The confidence that once seemed effortless now required work. Meanwhile, Owen continued expanding. New partnerships were finalized. The warehouse grew busier. The operation generated more revenue each month. One evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the industrial district, Bonnie stood beside her father overlooking the warehouse floor. Employees moved between workstations below. Customers inspected parts, phones rang. Business continued. Bonnie looked up at him. Did all of this really start with those cars? Owen followed her gaze toward the distant corner of the property where the remaining vehicles still sat. A small smile appeared. Not exactly. Bonnie waited. Then what started it? Owen looked across everything they had built. Seeing value, where other people only saw problems. And as he returned to the documents recovered from the 8th vehicle, he realized the final pieces of a much larger opportunity were beginning to come together. 3 months after the 12 vehicles arrived, the town of Millfield gathered for a business auction nobody had expected to matter. Yet, every seat was filled. Investors attended. Local business owners attended. Reporters stood along the walls. Even people who had laughed during those first days found reasons to be there. The item drawing attention was one of Diana Voss's dealerships. Months of rising costs, delayed expansion projects, and difficult market conditions had finally forced a decision. The dealership would be sold. Diana sat near the front of the room, composed as always. She still carried herself with confidence, but the certainty that once surrounded her had softened. Across the room, quiet conversations stopped when a familiar figure entered. Owen Calloway arrived, wearing the same simple style he had always preferred. No entourage, no dramatic entrance. Just a single father walking into a room that suddenly became silent. Bonnie walked beside him, holding a folder against her chest. The auction began. Several offers appeared early. Investors competed. Business groups made calculations. The numbers climbed steadily, then a final bid arrived. The room fell quiet. People looked toward Owen. Some seemed confused. Others smiled as realization spread. Weeks earlier, few would have believed he belonged in that room. Now nobody seemed surprised. After a brief review, the decision became official. The dealership had a new owner. Owen never celebrated. He simply nodded and shook hands. Across the room, Diana watched in silence. For a moment, their eyes met. Then she stood and walked toward him. The room seemed to hold its breath. Diana extended her hand. Owen accepted it. "Congratulations," she said, her voice carried no bitterness, only honesty. Owen nodded respectfully. "Thank you." Diana glanced toward Bonnie and then back at Owen. "You built all of this from an opportunity nobody else wanted." Owen looked at her for a second. "Not exactly. Diana waited. I built it from opportunities nobody else noticed. A small smile appeared on her face. For the first time in months, both of them understood the lesson hidden beneath everything that had happened. It had never been about the vehicles. It had never been about revenge. It had been about vision. Seeing value where others saw waste. Seeing potential where others saw problems. Later that evening, after the crowds disappeared and the headlines began spreading across the country, Owen and Bonnie stood outside the newly acquired dealership. The sign above the building reflected the last light of sunset. Bonnie looked up at her father. "Are we rich now?" she asked. Owen smiled and looked at the building, the warehouse, the partnerships, and the future that had grown from 12 forgotten vehicles. Then he looked down at his daughter. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "We are free." Bonnie smiled. Together they turned and walked toward the parking lot while the evening settled quietly around them. Neither looked back.